Number 9. Dillard Morrison. Morrison was born in Alabama in 1919. He gained notoriety early for the use of violence while beating up bigger bullies of friends as a school child. He picked up his nickname when he accidentally turned his hair red while trying to straighten it. Migrated to New York by way of South Carolina as a teen in 1937 to live with mother who had come years before. While not being particularly impressed by the big city, Morrison was distressed by the odd jobs he had to undertake to help provide for the household. After deciding manual labor was not for him, Morrison quickly earned underworld credibility by robbing craps players and numbers runners in Harlem, growing into a bona fide gangster in the late 1930s. Before long, Morrison became a major force within the Harlem criminal world. His early criminal enterprises showed no shortage of ambition. Disappointed with the take of one heist at Woolworth's, he immediately robbed a check-cashing shop. Even more than his appetite for illegal activity, it was Morrison's toughness that would become the stuff of legend. In one case, he was ambushed by a pair of assailants who shot him in the leg, but he turned around and chased the gunmen all the way back to their getaway car. Morrison came to the attention of the shot callers of that time, women like May, who ran the biggest brothel in town and had a dozen shoplifters on her payroll. Men like Big Joe Richards, undisputed boss of the Seaboard Negro rackets. Big Joe ruled varied crime kingdoms with an iron hand, yet succeeded by remaining in anonymity to all but his lieutenants and a few select friends. He ran an efficient enterprise, with every man and woman trained and chosen to do a particular job. Eventually, when Morrison was asked to become the right-hand man for Big Joe, he agreed. Due to his violent ways, Morrison was arrested for the first time, and on April 29, 1940, he appeared in special sessions on the charge of third-degree assault, but the maimed, bandaged man who had filed the charges refused to testify. The court had no choice but to discharge Morrison on his own recognizance. The beaten man's reluctance to testify was the first indication of the reign of terror which was to follow. On May 4, 1940, in Babylon, Long Island, Morrison received a suspended sentence on a third-degree assault charge. On June 4, 1940, in a Manhattan court, Morrison again drew a suspended sentence on a third-degree assault charge. In the mid-1940s, Morrison split with Big Joe and began buying heroin wholesale from Italian mobster Lucky Luciano, who imported it from Turkey. As Morrison's business grew, so too did his profile. His name began to turn up in local newspapers, both for the opulent parties he threw and for his criminal activities. On April 10, 1949, Morrison was arrested after he allegedly fired 4 shots through the door and window of Shep's Bar and Grill. In their last-ditch effort to capture the elusive Morrison, the authorities imported a young wise agent from the Midwest to work himself into the web of Harlem narcotics operations. On May 4, 1950, Morrison was arrested by federal officers, along with Robert Gator Lee and a white woman on charges of possession and sale of narcotics. Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The arrests came after Morrison allegedly delivered a half-ounce package of heroin to Lee. Morrison and Lee both pleaded not guilty in federal court to 3 counts of unlawful sale of heroin and was said to be the Harlem contact source for heroin, which was being smuggled into the United States from Turkey. Morrison returned in 1955 with promises of going straight, paralyzed in both legs due to prison fight in 1953. By 1979, Morrison was back in jail for the last time, after a girlfriend testified against him and he was convicted of drug charges. He died of bladder cancer in prison in 1989. Number 8. James Whitey Bulger. James Joseph. Whitey Bulger was the boss of the largely Irish mob in Boston from the 1970s through the 1990s. His longevity and success in organized crime largely can be attributed to protection he received as a high-level FBI informant. Bulger was notorious for his readiness to use violence and especially homicide to achieve his criminal goals. Bulger was attracted to street crime early in life, joining gangs and earning his first arrest at age 14, which sent him to the reformatory. Whitey, however, as a young man, was in and out of jail for various assault and theft charges, including military charges during his stint in the Air Force from 1948 to 52. In 1956, he was convicted of federal charges of hijacking and did his first stint in federal prison, landing in penitentiaries in Atlanta, Alcatraz, Leavenworth, and Lewisburg. While in the federal system, Bulger volunteered for experiments in which the CIA dosed prisoners with the hallucinatory drug LSD and other drugs in return for lesser sentences. Bulger was released in 1965, and he went to work for a local Irish-American gang at a time when rival factions were at war. Bulger, with the Killeen Gang, committed his first homicide during this war. In a case of mistaken identity, Bulger shot and killed the innocent twin brother of a rival gangster. In 1979, the boss and deputy of the Winter Hill Gang, as it became known, were arrested for fixing horse races, and Bulger took over the gang's leadership. In the early 1980s, Bulger continued to operate the Boston rackets with impunity while he accumulated more experience with homicide, including the killing of a completely innocent man who happened to be giving a lift home to one of Bulger's targets. Bulger, in that murder, was wearing a hat and a long-haired wig when he shot at the car. In the 1980s, Bulger started shaking down narcotics distributors and supplying weapons to the Irish Republican Army, which was fighting the British government in Northern Ireland. According to biographers, Bulger kept a sort of code around his involvement in narcotics, refusing to allow heroin to come into South Boston, for example. In 1991, Bulger muscled himself into a share of a $14 million winning lottery ticket from the legal lotto, a ticket that was sold in a store he controlled. Outside of the FBI, law enforcement investigators by this time were convinced that Bulger was a top criminal who was responsible for some of the most vicious massacres in Boston. In 1994, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Massachusetts State Police, and the Boston Police Department launched an investigation and, accurately believing the FBI had been compromised, kept the Bureau out of the loop until arrests were imminent. In December 1994, Connolly helped his informant one last time and told Bulger that arrests were coming. Bulger fled Boston, but his high-level associates in the gang were arrested. Bulger spent the next 16 years on the run as a fugitive. Bulger was arraigned on July 6, 2011, on 48 federal charges, including 19 charges of murder. 2 years later, a jury found Bulger guilty of 31 counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison, plus 5 years. Inmates beat him to death using a padlock stuffed inside a sock. Bulger's eyes also appeared to have been gouged out. After Bulger's death, the FBI was investigating the homicide, including how the inmates were able to gain access to Bulger's cell. Number 7. George Kelly Barnes, bootlegger, bank robber, and kidnapper. Machine Gun Kelly was born George Kelly Barnes on July 18, 1895 in Memphis, Tennessee. Despite the nickname Machine Gun, Kelly was a relatively minor criminal until a 1933 kidnapping made him infamous. Involved in bootlegging as a teenager, Kelly returned to the profitable illegal enterprise after several failed attempts at legitimate work. He was caught selling illegal liquor in 1927 and spent a few months in jail in New Mexico. Nabbed again, this time for selling liquor on an Indian reservation, Kelly did time at Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. While incarcerated, he made friends with several bank robbers. After his release from prison in 1930, Kelly traveled to St. Paul, Minnesota, continuing his crime spree. Kelly was involved in bank robberies in several states, including Iowa, Texas, and Washington. According to legend, Kelly's wife helped build his reputation, buying him a machine gun and nicknaming him after the weapon. She also reportedly gave away shell casings from his exploits to people as souvenirs to increase his notoriety. Along with bank robbing, Kelly made several attempts at kidnapping. They set up an elaborate system for the handling of their captive and the delivery of the ransom. Catherine Kelly's mother, Ora Shannon, lived on a ranch near Paradise. The place was raided, and several suspects, including Shannon, her husband and his son, were arrested on August 12th. They were quickly tried and convicted. Both were sentenced to life in prison on October 12th. Number 6. Luis Hernando. Luis Hernando Gomez Bustamante is a Colombian national who was one of the leaders of the North Valley Cartel, an organization involved in processing and smuggling approximately 500 metric tons of cocaine, worth more than $10 billion between 1990 and 2004 to the United States, primarily via Mexico and to Europe. The Gomez Bustamante organization moved narcotics by aircraft, go-fasts, and maritime cargo vessels. In March 2004, Government of Colombia seized properties belonging to Gomez Bustamante, valued at approximately $111 million under Operation Resplandor, an interdiction and surge operation initiated to maintain continued pressure on the North Valley Cartel. On July 2, 2004, Gomez Bustamante was arrested while trying to enter Cuba on a false passport. Judicial status. Gomez Bustamante was indicted in the Southern District of Virginia in January 1997 for continuing criminal enterprise, conspiracy, firearms, and money laundering. On October 10, 2002, an indictment was issued in the Eastern District of New York on Gomez Bustamante on charges of drug trafficking and money laundering. In July 2004, the Colombian government brought new charges against Gomez Bustamante for illicit enrichment and drug violations. In March 2004, a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C., indicted Gomez Bustamante on drug trafficking and RICO charges stemming from his leadership of the North Valley Cartel. Number 5. John Sonny Franzese. John Sonny Franzese, a prominent member of the Colombo crime family in New York, was involved in organized crime activity from the 1940s to the early 2000s. The violent, sociopathic, and amazingly long life of John Sonny Franzese, a former Colombo crime family underboss who once ran bookmaking, loan sharking, and extortion rackets in New York and Long Island. With few interruptions in the 1950s, Franzese took part in forceful extortions of businesses, loan sharking, bookmaking, and brutal gangland murders, from 40 to 50 assassinations by his own estimation. Working out of Roslyn, Long Island, he served as a lieutenant to Brooklyn gang chief Joseph Magliocco, who had succeeded the late Profaci family boss, Joe Profaci, in 1962. By the mid-60s, his harsh loan sharking and bookmaking operations had invaded the New York suburbs and Suffolk County, including his driving out the husband and wife owners of an ice cream parlor to insert a gambling operation. However, amid nationwide crackdowns on organized crime, federal and New York law enforcement were catching up to him. In late 1964, his crooked life began to crumble when the New York State's Investigation Commission ordered him and his fellow loan sharks to testify about criminal threats and extortion in Suffolk. Franzese pleaded the Fifth Amendment 18 times to avoid questions about his work for Magliocco. Now a target of the grand jury, Franzese, considered the boss of rackets in Long Island and muscle man enforcer of street loans, was indicted in March 1966 on charges related to his strong-arming for a $10 million per year bookmaking ring in New York's Broadway area and the Garment District. Sonny's legal problems grew in April 1966 when the FBI arrested him following an indictment by a federal grand jury, listing him as the mastermind of a gang that robbed more than $65,000 from 4 banks and loan associations in New York, Massachusetts, and Utah. Prosecutors believed it was the first case of bank robbery by the Cosa Nostra. Investigators also suspected Franzese's ring in the March 1966 theft of $2 million in jewelry from a Miami hotel. While Franzese stood before a judge at his arraignment on murder charges in a Queens criminal court, reporters for the New York Daily News described the then 47-year-old as a dapperly dressed, powerfully built man wearing a gray pinstripe suit and carrying a gray top coat. In 1967, a court convicted him, and the judge handed down a 50-year sentence in federal prison. Franzese won parole in 1978, but went back to prison at least 6 times for violating parole after police spied him meeting fellow wise guys in public. At the ripe old age of 93, instead of retiring, he was still physically threatening enough to force extortion payments from the hustler and penthouse gentlemen's clubs in Manhattan. Number 4. Anthony Corallo. In 1943, Corallo was appointed as a capo regime of his own crew, an accomplishment for a man in his early 30s. He then moved his base of operations from East Harlem to Queens. Corallo and Dio eventually controlled 5 local chapters of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. These labor racketeering activities generated millions of dollars for the Galliano family. From 1941 to 1960, Corallo was arrested at least 12 times for various crimes. However, none of the cases even made it to trial. Lucchese was amazed at Corallo's ability to avoid or duck convictions. On June 19, 1968, Corallo was convicted in the Marcus bribery case. On July 26, 1968, Corallo was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. One of Corallo's first moves as boss was to take over gravel distribution in various areas of New York, such as Long Island. In owning major gravel companies in his territories or areas of influence, Corallo increased the Lucchese crime family's influence in the construction industry and with the unions involved. The garbage industry would be next on his list. With the help of a union official named Bernie Adelstein, the front business would be called Private Sanitation Industry Association. Next, with the help of Lucchese capo Paul Vario and his crew, Corallo would gain power at John F. Kennedy International Airport. In the early 1980s, Corallo unwittingly provided the government with evidence that would all but end his career. Over the years, Corallo and Salvatore Avellino established a stranglehold on the waste-hauling business on Long Island. To gather evidence against Avellino, members of the New York State Organized Crime Task Force used undercover informant Robert Kubeka, the owner of a Suffolk County garbage hauling business. In 1983, members of the New York State Organized Crime Task Force installed an electronic surveillance device inside the dashboard on Avellino's Jaguar while he and his wife were at a dinner dance. Agents then listened to many conversations between Corallo, Avellino, and other mobsters as they drove around the city. From these recorded conversations, OCTF learned the Commission's internal structure, history, and relations with other crime families. These conversations were shared with federal prosecutors and provided them with invaluable evidence against Corallo and other family bosses in the Mafia Commission trial. On February 25, 1985, Corallo and other mob leaders were indicted in the Mafia Commission trial. On November 19, 1986, Corallo and the other defendants were convicted of all racketeering charges. On January 13, 1987, Corallo was sentenced to 100 years in prison and fined $240,000. On August 23, 2000, Anthony Corallo died of natural causes at the Federal Medical Center for Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Number 3. Felix Mitchell. Felix Wayne Mitchell, also known as Felix the Cat, was a notorious drug kingpin operating in Oakland, California, who headed the criminal organization known as the 69 Mob. Born on August 23, 1954 in East Oakland, California, Mitchell began a life of crime early. While still a teen, he created a network of criminals and nicknamed them the 69 Mob. The crew expanded rapidly, creating a drug empire focused primarily on the sale of H that encompassed not only Oakland, but surrounding Bay Area cities. His success did not go unnoticed. His network continued expanding and began including kingpins from Los Angeles and Detroit, Michigan. Mitchell's success, however, was not without difficulties. He faced opposition from Mickey Moore and his associated criminal family, in addition to the Funktown USA gang led by Harvey Weissenton over control of the East Bay heroin market. Nonetheless, his drug business was incredibly successful, and it was estimated Mitchell was earning anywhere between $400,000 and $1 million per month. With his drug wealth, Felix Mitchell lived lavishly, throwing parties, buying expensive cars, and purchasing fancy clothing. Additionally, he shared his income with local youth and community programs. Consequently, Mitchell quickly became a local folk hero. In order to maintain control over their turf, the '69 mob utilized many techniques that have now become the basis of the modern drug trade. These techniques included the use of children as delivery agents and spotters, along with drive-by shootings to punish both their enemies and disobedient clients. By the 1980s, Mitchell's heroin empire had grown to epic proportions and was the continued target of many attacks. Conflict was unavoidable, and violence became part of their standard operations. Given his high profile, Mitchell, not surprisingly, became the target of local authorities. In 1985, Oakland police captured and arrested Mitchell. He was then tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. A year later, on August 21, 1986, at Leavenworth Penitentiary, a fellow inmate murdered Mitchell. Mitchell died 2 days before his 32nd birthday. Felix Mitchell's funeral followed over a week later on August 29, 1986. The amount of money spent and the incredible number of onlookers garnered national attention. The funeral procession, which included 4 Rolls-Royces, multiple limousines, a horse-drawn carriage, and a $6,000 coffin, was viewed by an estimated 8,000 mourners along the route. Many law enforcement supporters used the event as proof of the significant impact drugs were having on the country, and particularly on vulnerable, impoverished neighborhoods in cities like Oakland. Mitchell's incarceration and death did not lead to the destruction of the heroin industry. Rather, both the level and scope of crime and the volume of drugs on the streets of Oakland and other East Bay communities increased heavily after his funeral. This became known as the Felix Mitchell paradox. Without Mitchell maintaining control over the market, it quickly spun out of control and resulted in even greater growth and more violence. Number 2. Antonio Fernandez. Antonio Fernandez, also known as King Tone, is the former head of the Latin Kings. In 1999, Fernandez was sentenced to 12 to 15 years for conspiring to sell narcotics. He is the main figure in the HBO documentary, Latin Kings, a street gang story, which was released in 2007. He is also featured in the book The Misfit Economy by Alexa Clay, which was published in 2015. Upon his release, Fernandez has shared his insights as a former gang leader and political activist, and how that relates to the legitimate world. In 1997, a few months after his appointment as leader of the Latin Kings, the New York Times posed the question whether Fernandez was a man of vision or of violence. They concluded he was the former, a man with the self-assigned mission of transforming the Latin Kings from an organized crime syndicate to a political movement, fighting for social justice on behalf of suppressed Latin American communities. He seemed set for a life of addiction and crime until he went to prison and found solace in a gang. He saw something in the criminal organization that others didn't, a place that offered the structure and love that he needed to beat addiction. From his own experiences, he knew the Latin Kings had more to offer. Mirroring the activism of groups such as the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, he wanted to reform and rebrand the Latin Kings and its 7,000 members. He united the divided sects of the gang and presented his ideas at local meetings, building the new principles of the Latin Kings from the ground up. He had former gang members canvass for politicians and feed the homeless. The younger members were given curfews and sheltered from elder members who were entrenched in crime. The police called him a gangster with a PR campaign, but to many he was a symbol of hope. Number 1. Thomas Silverstein. Silverstein was born in Long Beach, California. At the age of 19, Silverstein was sent to San Quentin Prison in California for armed robbery. 4 years later, he was paroled, but he was arrested soon after for armed robbery again. Their take was less than $11 at the time. In 1977, Silverstein was sentenced to 15 years for armed robbery, to be served at United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. While at Leavenworth, Silverstein developed ties with the Aryan Brotherhood. In 1980, Silverstein was convicted of the massacre of inmate Danny Atwell, who reportedly refused to serve as a mule for heroin being moved through the prison. He was sentenced to life and transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, USP Marion, which was then a high-security facility. The conviction was overturned in 1985 after it emerged that the jailhouse informants who testified at his trial had perjured themselves on the stand. At Marion, Silverstein was housed in the control unit, a virtual solitary confinement regime reserved for extreme management problems in the prison. Thomas Silverstein spent his time in solitary confinement with a constant ceiling light, ensuring uninterrupted camera surveillance. He was allowed only 2 phone calls per month and received his meals through a slot. In 1981, Silverstein was accused of the slaughter of Robert Chappelle, a member of the D.C. Blacks prison gang. Silverstein and another inmate, Clayton Fountain, were convicted, and Silverstein received an additional life sentence. He avoided a possible death sentence since capital punishment on the federal level had not been reinstated yet. Silverstein maintained his innocence. While Silverstein was on trial for Chappelle's homicide, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith, the national leader of the D.C. Blacks prison gang, from another prison into the control unit in Marion. From the moment Smith arrived in the control unit, prison logs show that he began trying to execute Silverstein. "I tried to tell Cadillac that I didn't slaughter Chappelle, but he didn't believe me, and he bragged that he was going to assassinate me," Silverstein recalled. "Everyone knew what was going on, and no one did anything to keep us apart. The guards wanted one of us to execute the other." Silverstein and Clayton Fountain slayed Smith with improvised weapons, wounding him 67 times. After Smith was dead, they dragged his body up and down the catwalk in front of the cells, displaying it to other prisoners. Silverstein received another life sentence. Silverstein died on May 11, 2019, at age 67, at St. Anthony Hospital in Lakewood, Colorado, after spending 36 years in solitary confinement. He died due to complications from heart surgery.